Welcome, everyone. Good Wednesday. Thank you all for joining us for this session of the Global Seminar Series on Energy and Climate Policy in Emerging Asia. I am Wei-Ping Wu, a professor in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University and director of the MS Urban Planning program there. Before we get started, I just wanted to encourage everyone to type in your questions, even during presentations and during the moderated discussion in the Q&A part of the Zoom, and we will welcome you in that box. And we will also ask you perhaps to hold your questions, right, until the moderated discussion. So I am really very pleased to see a distinguished panel of scholars to share their thoughts and research on this very important topic on particularly energy use in China and how it relates to climate change. So in the interest of time, let me briefly introduce each of the speakers, and then each of them will give a presentation. And then we will go into a moderated discussion session. First, we have Dr. Pierre Noel, is a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. His research interests sit at the intersections between international energy markets and public policy choices. He has worked on energy security policy in Europe with special reference to Russia and other countries in the region. He specialized in changing natural gas market structures and how they impact policy choices. Prior to joining the center, Dr. Noel was a senior fellow in economic and energy security at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, based primarily in Singapore and London. Our second speaker is David Sandalo, is the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy and co-director of the Energy and Environmental Concentration at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He funded and directs the Center's US-China program, is author of the Guide to Chinese Climate Policy. During fall 2019, he was a distinguished visiting professor in the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University. Prior to coming to Columbia, Mr. Sandalo has served in senior positions at the White House, State Department, and US Department of Energy. And our third speaker, Erica Downs, is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, SIPA, focusing on Chinese energy markets and geopolitics. She has had a distinguished career in Eurasian energy policy with a focus on China. She has over 15 years of experience working in the public and nonprofit sectors. Prior to joining Columbia, she worked as a senior research scientist in the China Studies program of the CNA Corporation and other organizations. Last but not least, Dr. Chang Liu, who has worked as a senior researcher at Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization since 2017, focusing on economics, energy, climate change, and sustainable development studies and IAM modeling. Prior to joining the organization, Dr. Liu was a researcher at National Climate Center in China, in China's Meteorological Administration, responsible for economic analysis of climate disaster impact and modeling from 2013 to 2017. And he also has worked as a visiting scholar at Harvard University, China project to study wind resource assessment. So with that, I will hand over to our presenters, and each will share their thoughts and research briefly with the audience.
Great. I suppose I'm starting here, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this wonderful panel. Let me just share my screen with you. Can you see my slides? Yeah, okay, that's great. This is about the most important country in the world as far as climate change is concerned. China is absolutely central to whether we are going to succeed or fail, or perhaps more to the point, to what extent we're going to succeed or fail. And that is because China has seen a very rapid growth in its economic output per person and an even more rapid growth of its CO2 emissions per person. And that is because that is the product of rapid economic growth in a very carbon intensive economy. And because China is such a big country with such a large population, this has translated into massive growth into energy-related CO2 emissions, with a clear inflection point and a dramatic acceleration around year 2000. Since the beginning of this century, China really has been the driving force behind the growth of global carbon emissions, and therefore it is now central to the global effort to reduce those emissions. So let's have a quick look at what China has committed in terms of addressing its CO2 emissions. Three targets, three objectives have been put forward. You will find other objectives, but they really are means to an end. These are the really directly CO2 related objectives. The first one is that in 2030, the CO2 intensity of Chinese GDP should be at least 65% below the level it was in 2005. In the same year, 2030, by the same year, emissions must have reached their maximum point. They must have started to decline. And 30 years later, by 2060, China must have reached net zero emissions, which means that the carbon that will be released in the atmosphere by China at that time will not be bigger than the amount of carbon that is removed from the atmosphere by Chinese forests or other natural or artificial carbon sinks. Let's look at the first of these objectives. 2030 CO2 intensity of GDP at least 65% below 2005. So I've put on this graph the history so far, and I put 1979 as an important point for us here, because it's the beginning of China's economic reforms, and it's really the date at which the journey towards modern China, economically speaking, started. It's also very convenient because 79, 2019, 2060, these are two periods of 40 years each. So let's look at what happened to China's CO2 intensity of the CO2 intensity of Chinese GDP in that period. It declined very steadily at an average rate of a little more than 4% per year, with, as you can see, with the exception of a short period, relatively little variance around the average. So what I did is I extrapolated this decline rate to 2060, which is the date where China must reach net zero. So the same decline rate extrapolated to 2060. And the first lesson the first takeaway here for you is that the 2030 intensity target doesn't look that challenging in the sense that it sits above, or just slightly above, the line that extrapolates the past 40 years of decline. So China should be able to reach this first target relatively easily. Now, of course, we're not interested, as far as climate change is concerned, by ratios. We are interested in absolute emissions. And so if you translate this decline in intensity into absolute emissions, using, of course, past GDP, past economic growth for the black line, and OECD long-term GDP assumptions for the future, what you end up with, and that's lesson number 2, is that emissions should peak nicely, not only before 2030, but even before 2025, at a bit above 10 billion tons a year. So, of course, this is assuming the growth of China's economy is in line with what is expected by the OECD. This second objective should not be too difficult to achieve as well. If China's GDP growth is stronger, then it will be more challenging, of course. But there's another lesson here, and that is that in 2060, if we keep by this rate of decline in CO2 intensity, there are still 5 gigatons of gross emissions in China, and that is probably above and even far above what can be removed by carbon sinks. So net zero in that case would be missed and look really challenging. So just an alternative case to put an additional number here. If you increase the average decline by roughly 50%, so you model an acceleration in the decline in CO2 intensity of Chinese GDP, then you reach 1.5 gigaton gross emissions in 2060, which looks much more reasonable in terms of the amount that can be removed, and therefore probably closer to net zero. So the fourth lesson is that the decline in the carbon intensity of Chinese GDP will have to accelerate pretty dramatically compared to the previous 40 years. Now, the decline in CO2 intensity of GDP is the product of 2 other intensities. The CO2, the energy intensity of GDP, the amount of energy that's embedded in 1 unit of economic output in China, times the amount of carbon that's embedded in each unit of energy. And what we see from the data is that most of the decline so far is explained by the decline in energy intensity. In other words, the decarbonization of Chinese energy has barely started. It has started, but it's the very, very early stages. And therefore, given that it looks difficult to accelerate the rate of fall in energy intensity of GDP, the decarbonization of Chinese energy will have to accelerate really dramatically if China is to come anywhere close to its long-term targets. And therefore, the explosion in the amount in the supply of clean energy in China that we've seen in the past 20 years, very rapid growth from a very low base, this will have to be maintained and even accelerated over time so that the decarbonization can really accelerate, and crucially, that the absolute amount of coal that is burned in China can start to go down for the sake of China and for the sake of the world. And that's it for me. I look forward to your questions during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Noel. Now let's turn to Dr. Liu Changi.
Hi. Thanks, Weiping, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this seminar organized by Columbia University. So good morning and good evening. It's very pleased to attend this seminar. And the topic of my presentation is the road to net zero by 2060 and the China energy interconnection for achieving the carbon neutrality in China. These results are based on our latest report called the Research Report on China's Carbon Neutrality Before 2060, which was written by Geopolitical team. And of course, the viewpoints I will present today are my personal viewpoints. It does not necessarily represent my institution. Well, first slide is about China's carbon neutrality pathways of the total CO2 emissions, the energy sectors, and the power sectors. In this picture, you can find the different sectors from 2020 to 2060. And first, before that, we do this quantitative study based on the IAM modeling, the integrated assessment modeling called the message flow biome, which was developed by YASA and Geopolitical together. And we made innovation of this study, try to combine the IAM modeling with the energy optimization model and the power grid modeling together. This is a big innovation in this study. And we made the socio-economic assumptions for the critical inputs for this study, which is about the which includes the economy, the population, and the future energy demands, power demands, etc. And so we after this calculation of this IAM modeling, we can get the optimization of the total CO2 emissions, energy CO2 emissions, and power CO2 emissions for China. And in this figure, you can find three pathways. The black line is about the total CO2 emissions. You can find it will peak before 2030 at around 2028, and then it rapidly decreases during the 2030 to 2050 and reach net zero before 2060 at around 2055. The next line is the energy sector CO2 emissions, and you can find the dashed red line. It shows same decreasing pattern with the total CO2 emissions. And the third solid red line is the power CO2 emissions. And you can find the power CO2 emissions takes the largest share of the total CO2 mitigations, which is the largest sector, also the most important sector for the future mitigation sector. And the power sector needs to mitigate first and achieve the net zero target at around 2050. Then the energy CO2 pathway goes to net zero emissions at around 2055. So this can contribute to the total CO2 carbon neutral. The right picture shows the different sectors, the contribution rules for different sectors, which you can find the power sector and the final sectors, including industry sector, transport, and building sectors, takes about 80% of the mitigation contribution, while other sectors like the industrial process and non-OCF, land use change, and waste sector can play a relatively small role for the carbon neutral. This slide is about the energy system zero emission transition. first is about the energy supply transition. And there are two most important factors. One is the fossil fuel peak, and the other is the clean energy share increase. And this is a result of the total primary energy supply and the clean energy share in the total energy supply. You can find that the total fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and the natural gas, will still keep increasing a little bit before 2030, then reduce very sharply after 2040. And to be specific, the coal consumption has already peaked in 2013 at around 2.8 gigaton coal equivalent, and then keep decreasing. The oil consumption will gradually decrease, and it will reach peak before 2030, with the peak at around 740 million tons of oil. The natural gas, however, it will keep increasing until 2035 at around 500 billion cubic meter, then decrease. And the clean energy will become the dominant energy source after 2040, larger than 50%. The second is transition to electric-centric energy use. And the electricity will become the major form of the energy use. And from 2020 to 2060, the electricity will increase about 3 times. And in 2060, 2/3 of the energy use in the final sector will be electricities. And the electrification in the industry, transport, and building sectors will increase very significantly. Well, the third is about the power system transition, and in China, they are the renewable resources are mainly located in the west and the north region. So, in order to achieve the zero emissions for the power sectors, one way is to reduce the fossil fuel power, and another way is to exploit the clean energy power in those west and north regions. I will not go into the details, and if you are interested, I can provide later. Well, in the future, the power grid's infrastructure will be very critical to achieve the carbon neutral, and China will build synchronous ultra-high voltage grids in the eastern and the western China in order to achieve the power transmission from the west to east and from north to south, and cross-border interconnections. And in the future, the power grid system has we call it the 3 high characteristics. It is the high clean ratio, high transmission, and high electronization. So in the future power grid system, it actually is quite vulnerable to extreme climate events, such as the extreme cold storm or extreme heat waves, like what we have seen in the February in Texas, the outage due to the extreme cold storm. And it happens also in China this year. So in the future, with even higher clean ratio, it will be, we need to pay more attention to the climate extreme risks as Great Rhino and Black Swan risks. The last slide is about the cost benefit of the carbon neutral in China. The total investment in the energy system is about 18 trillion US dollars, and the power system investment is about 9 trillion US dollars, half of the total energy investment. And the marginal abatement cost is about $38 per ton CO2, which is a little bit lower than the 1.5 degree scenario, which is 50 US dollars per ton CO2. And we've done a comprehensive study about the synergies and co-benefits of the carbon neutral investment. It will bring a lot of synergies, such as to promote the economic development and provide jobs and avoiding climate damage, reduce the air pollutants, and bring great human health benefits. And the results shows that the total comprehensive co-benefits will reach 160 trillion US dollars, which is about 9 times of the investment needed. So it is cost efficient to achieve the carbon neutral by applying the China energy interconnection solution. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Let's now turn to Dr. Erica Downs.
Okay. Good morning and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am going to talk about what the 14th five-year plan says about energy supply security and some of the implications for China's transition to a lower carbon future. One of the things that really strikes me about the 14th five-year plan are heightened concerns about the security of China's energy supplies, especially oil, natural gas, and coal. There are several reasons for this, which I've listed on the slide. One is that the 14th five-year plan devotes a chapter subsection to the issue of energy supply security. Another reason is that the plan talks about meeting China's core demand for oil and natural gas with self-sufficiency or self-reliance, which is a new phrase. This language is not in the 13th five-year plan. The 14th five-year plan also talks about the importance of protecting China's import channels and nodes. It also promotes coal to oil and coal to gas projects. And it mentions coal in a number of places in the plan that suggests that domestic coal is a source of energy supply security. In addition to the coal to oil and the coal to gas projects, it talks about improving coal transportation within China, and it also allows for some growth in coal power generation capacity. And finally, the 14th five-year plan includes, and I think this is for the first time in a five-year plan, a binding target for an energy production floor. And this includes all types of energy. So it's wind and solar and hydro, nuclear, in addition to coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, these supply security concerns center on oil and natural gas, with there probably being greater concern about oil import dependence than natural gas import dependence. Right now, China imports more than 70% of its oil and more than 40% of its natural gas. However, increasing import dependence is not a new issue for China. It obviously has been going on for many years. And so that suggests that there's something else that's also contributing to this greater concern about energy supply security. And in my view, that something else is perceptions of a less favorable external environment. The first chapter of the 14th five-year plan states that China faces an increasing complex international environment. And one part of this increasingly complex international environment is the deterioration of the relations between China and the United States in recent years. And this increased tension between the US and China has affected the energy sector. If we go back about 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, President Xi instructed China's national oil companies to increase oil and gas production in the name of enhancing national energy security. In addition, some former national oil company executives have spoken in recent years about the need to increase China's oil and gas production, as well as the need to become more self-sufficient in certain technologies that China imports to develop its domestic oil and gas resources out of concerns that these could be disrupted, perhaps in the same way that the US import bans on Huawei and ZTE, disrupted their supply chains. And of course, all of this together has made domestic energy resources seem more secure. And this is my last slide. And just by way of conclusion, I'd like to discuss a few implications of what these greater concerns about energy supply security might mean for the energy transition. And the first point I'd like to make is that geopolitical concerns, this perception of a less favorable international environment, may facilitate the transition precisely because it has generated heightened concerns about being dependent on other countries for oil and natural gas and technologies needed to produce them. The one caveat to this, though, is whether supply security concerns push China to increase coal use in the shorter term, so over the next 5 years. Another implication for the energy transition, of course, is that these concerns support import diversification. Looks like there might be a typo on that slide. China, of course, has done a very good job in diversifying its oil and natural gas imports and import routes, and concerns about supply security are just going to underscore that that's a good thing to do to enhance security of those supplies. A third point is that natural gas is likely to be a bridge fuel. And this basically checks 2 boxes that China's national oil companies have to check. The first one is increasing domestic energy supplies to enhance national energy security. And the other is doing their part to help China transition to a lower carbon future. And all 3 national oil companies have identified natural gas and their efforts to increase production of natural gas as one of the things they're doing to support China's move to a lower carbon future. And finally, with natural gas poised to play a larger role in the energy transition, this makes the management of methane emissions key. Methane is a greenhouse gas that's actually considerably more potent than carbon dioxide. And if there are leaks of methane anywhere in the production, distribution, or consumption of natural gas, this can negate any benefits that natural gas has for climate change. And so this makes China's ongoing efforts to control methane emissions very important. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Downs. And now, last we turn to David Sandalo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Wu. And thank you to the organizers of this really interesting event. I'm going to talk about China-US climate change diplomacy. Our 2 countries, China and the United States, are the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. Together, we represent about 40% or more of global emissions. And so what our 2 countries do matters a lot from a climate change standpoint. And diplomacy between our 2 countries has been in the news lately. And so I thought it might be particularly interesting to talk about that topic today. The basic question I'm going to ask is portrayed by this cartoon, which is, can our 2 countries join hands and work together on climate change? And what's the implication for the climate change issue? I think there's some reasons that it is possible that our 2 countries could work well together. First, both of our governments have some very ambitious climate change goals. I think most people listening here know that President Xi committed to China achieving carbon neutrality before 2060 last year at the United Nations. And President Joe Biden has an extremely ambitious climate change agenda. This was underscored at the really historic summit that he convened last week, a virtual summit of 40 leaders on the topic of climate change. He's also made proposals that are more ambitious in fighting climate change than any administration in the history of the United States. Really transformational proposals when it comes to spending on clean energy and in a number of different, a number of other areas. And he's appointed John Kerry as a special climate envoy. Secretary Kerry is one of the leading politicians in the United States of the last several decades. Has had many top level positions and is now devoting his considerable talents solely to the climate change issue, really reflecting the priority that President Biden attaches to this issue. So if both China and the US agree that climate change is a priority and needs to be addressed, that's one reason you think they might be able, two countries might be able to work together. Our two countries are also very vulnerable to climate change in some of the same ways. And I just thought I would share a couple of pictures of that. This is a computer projection of Pudong in Shanghai and what that will look like after 2 degrees C of global warming. Global warming raises sea levels. It does that for 2 reasons, because glaciers melt, particularly in Antarctica and Greenland, and because a warmer molecule is bigger than a colder molecule, so you have thermal expansion of the oceans. And so coastal cities all over the world, including in China, are going to be very threatened by sea level rise. And I think it's important to highlight that right now the world is not on a path to avoid 2 degrees C of global warming. This is a likely future unless we change course. And obviously it's going to be very expensive in Shanghai and other cities to try to address this type of sea level rise. And by the way, this is what Shanghai would look like after 4 degrees C of global warming. And this is not an impossible future. This could happen unless we get serious as a world about addressing the problem of climate change. And of course, it's not just China. This is a picture of Miami, Florida, after 2 degrees C of global warming. And this is Miami, Florida, after 4 degrees C of global warming. So these are serious issues that affect both of our countries in very important ways. There are many other vulnerabilities. And so that's a common interest that we share. I think maybe we could work together on it. We also have a long history of working together on science, technology, and environmental issues. Here's a picture of President Jimmy Carter in the United States and the Deng Xiaoping, Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, normalizing relations between our two countries. When they did that, among the first agreements they signed were agreements to work together on science technology issues. Here is our president, the first President Bush from the United States, and Jiang Zemin, who worked together on these issues as well. This is one of my favorite pictures. These are 2 Chinese and 2 US diplomats. The one on the far left is my former boss, Secretary Stephen Chu. On the far right, that's Minister Wang Gang, Minister of Science and Technology. This was at the signing of the agreement of the US-China Clean Energy Research Center agreements, which was about 10 years ago now. Here's President Obama and President Xi Jinping working together or shaking hands as they signed a bilateral agreement on climate change in 2014. And let's see. Here's another. This is Minister Xie Zhenhua, who's currently the special envoy for climate change in China, signing a agreement with Governor Jerry Brown of California to work together on climate change. So it's really a long history of our two countries working together on this issue. And I particularly highlight that the bilateral agreement between the United States and China in 2014 was seen by many observers, I think correctly, as a principal foundation for the Paris Agreement that was signed the next year. And this actually is at Paris. This is Secretary John Kerry and Minister Xie Zhenhua, who are currently our two leading our two special climate envoys for the two countries, talking together in Paris. They've worked together for a long time. However, as Erica already alluded to, and as I think everybody here will know, our two countries are right now in a state of really strong tension. The two governments, there's distrust and discord at a level that really hasn't been seen in decades, in many ways since normalization of relations. The different views in both governments are very strong. That came out very strongly in the first meeting between Biden administration officials and Chinese government officials in Alaska about a month ago. And there's a range of extremely serious disagreements on a broad range of issues, raising questions about whether we can really work together on climate change. I think we can, and I think about 10 days ago, representatives of our two governments met in Shanghai, led by Secretary Kerry and Minister Xie Zhenhua, and signed an agreement to work together on climate change, notwithstanding our strong differences in other areas. And in the rest of my talk, I'm just going to quickly suggest three areas that I think might be most promising for our two countries to work together. The first is green finance. And both countries have really strong activities underway in this area. The People's Bank of China was the first central bank in the world to have green finance standards. The Biden administration is deeply committed on green finance, made announcements on that at last week's summit. And in the United States, we see enormous mobilization of private capital towards low carbon development. And I think, just to get specific, we can work on harmonizing taxonomies for green finance, harmonizing disclosure requirements for companies related to climate change, sharing emissions trading experience. The United States has deep experience with emissions trading. China's just launching its first national program for carbon dioxide emissions trading. And then I hope we can mobilize capital for green development in third countries. The Belt and Road Initiative could do much more than it currently is doing, to say the least, to promote green development. Right now, an enormous amount of the funding under the Belt and Road Initiative is for high carbon development. I think our two countries could work together to mobilize green development in third countries in some very helpful ways. I think we could work together on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. It's a really important technology where there are US technologies that could be deployed in China in ways that would make a difference for the global climate. There's some big challenges here, particularly related to intellectual property protection, but I think there's a possibility they could be overcome and we could work together on this. And then a third area is on emissions from the food system. More than 30% of global emissions of greenhouse gases come from the food system. It doesn't get as much attention as it should, in my view. And simple programs like programs to cut back on food waste could help to address the problem of climate change. Actually, President Xi Jinping already has a clean plate campaign. I think there's much more the two countries could do to work together to fight emissions, cut back emissions from the food system. So those are just three ideas. I believe that cooperation between our two governments is going to be really challenging in the years ahead because of the strong disagreements, but I think it's possible. And I think if we're able to, reach some really concrete, if we take some really concrete steps together, it can make a big difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So we will have just maybe 10 minutes or so a moderated panel discussion before we open up to questions from the audience. We actually already have some. So again, for those watching online, I am Professor Wei-Ping Wu, and I'm here with Erica Downs, Senior Research Scholar at Columbia SIPA Center on Global Energy and Policy, and Dr. Liu Changi, Senior Researcher at Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization, Dr. Pierre Noel, Global Research Scholar at Columbia SIPA Center on Global Energy Policy, and David Sandalo, Inaugural Fellow at Columbia SIPA Center for Global Energy Policy and Co-Director of the Energy and Environment Concentration at Columbia SIPA. So here we're discussing China's recent accomplishment and challenges and goals for the future of energy policy and climate change in a global context. And so if I may take my little bit of a privilege of being the moderator to ask the panelists if you could illustrate on a couple of thoughts that came up as you were presenting. I'm not an expert on energy and energy policy, but as I was listening, that it struck me of how climate change policies and particular energy policies involve so much more sectors of the economy and involve so much more global cooperation, right? So if you were to put your heads together to think about what might be the key sources of energy powering China's economy by 2060, you know, that carbon neutral, what would they be? Because I actually think it's probably going to be quite different from the US. And then so David, you mentioned about food, but I think a big part is transportation. And, you know, recently US is talking about now turning all the car manufacturing into completely, you know, electric, right? And that's a big turnaround in the mobility mode that we're looking at in the US, and how will China deal with that? And then I also have a question specifically for Erica, and the natural gas issue comes up in your presentation. And again, in US, there's been very recent movement, you know, it's been a while, about the indoor pollution caused by natural gas. And many states now are moving towards really doing more about that. So just want to open up our moderated discussion with those couple of questions. And for anyone.
I'm happy to start. But...
Yeah, absolutely, David.
So you asked about different sources of power, which is a really good question. So right now, there are about a half a dozen zero carbon ways to generate power. There's solar power, wind power, hydropower, which is very important in China, a lot of hydropower. There's geothermal power. There's nuclear power, which is also important and growing in China. And then there's fossil fuel power, where you capture the carbon and store it underground. Right now, those are basically the ways of generating low carbon, zero carbon power. Looking out over 40 years, one could imagine some major innovations. You know, a lot has changed in the past 40 years. 40 years ago, the internet didn't exist, or if it, you know, barely existed, the world looked pretty different 40 years ago. So over that horizon, one could imagine innovations in things like fusion power, which is another type of nuclear power. One could imagine, you know, there's people working on kind of wild ideas like mirrors in space that send power down to Earth. But I think the list that I started with, that's probably the sources of power that we're going to be drawing from. And I think solar power, wind power, and hydropower are, you know, areas where people have a lot of hope, you know, for a significant generation. I think carbon capture technologies are going to be really important. My own view is there's no way we're going to achieve zero carbon economies without some type of fossil and carbon capture. And then the most controversial is nuclear, because nuclear is a source of massive zero carbon power, but it has two main problems with it. One of them is it's very expensive. And the second is public acceptance around the world is really low. Public, you know, just they're scared of nuclear power, think it's very dangerous. And so there's often big resistance to nuclear power around the world. So those are the basic sources of zero carbon power.
So just to build on some of the points that David made, I would flag carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This is an area I've been looking at this in China's oil industry. China's oil companies have been developing CCUS projects, looking into CCUS for a while. China National Petroleum Corporation a few years ago launched the world's, I think, 18th large-scale CCUS project. And CNPC is also a member of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. And one thing it's doing in conjunction with OGCI is developing, one of 5, CCUS industrial bases in China. And so I'm hoping that between the participation in the OGCI efforts to make progress on CCUS, and with China's 2060 carbon neutrality goal, that perhaps we will see some more activity in this area.
Well, I'd like to add something. I totally agree with David and Eric. And, I think not only China and United States, but also for other countries, they can have the same, but they will have something different in the power system in the future. For example, every country will put a lot of emphasis on the renewables, solar, wind, hydro, etc. And for China specifically, the coal and natural gas will totally be phased out after 2050, and almost over 90% of the power system will be supplied by wind and the renewables or clean energies. But some countries may have some difference. For example, I don't know, perhaps in the United States, they will use more carbon capture and storage, that CCS, in the natural gas power sectors, because they may be more fit for, it may be more cost efficient for them. Yeah. So that's my viewpoint.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm wondering if any one of you have any questions for each other in terms of the presentation that were just very thoughtful, if they created more questions. Yes, Pierre.
Yes, a question for Changi. And I think this question was actually asked by someone in the chat, if I'm not mistaken. It's about the level of energy demand in your projections. It seems to continue to grow fairly steadily until, if I remember well, 2030 or so, and then it abruptly stops. So the growth in energy demand seems to stop around 2040. You will confirm that perhaps. And I want to ask you, in that respect, whether China simply replicates what has happened in other countries as they became richer, or whether there is something specific to China here, and in that case, what is triggering it? Is it a particularly aggressive policy intervention from the government, or are you betting on some kind of technological advances that would reduce or increase efficiency and therefore limit the growth in demand? So really about your demand projections.
Thank you for the audience, and thank you, Pierre. That's a very important question. And the simple answer for this is the main drivers for the total energy demand first increase, then before 2030, then decrease after 2030. The main driver is the energy efficiency of different fuels. For example, as we know, the electricity is the most efficient, energy. So take the electric vehicle and the oil vehicle as an example. For the same, the distance, the electric vehicle will take only half of the energy used for the same distance. So it's 2 times energy efficient than the oil. So in this way, if the society use more and more electricities, so this kind of in order to satisfy even the same total amount of the useful energy we need for daily living, for the society to running, if you use more electricity, it will be much more efficient than the traditional coal or oil-based energy system, and the total amount of this kind of energy amount will be lower than the latter. Yes, that's the main reason. The other reason is you can find there will be energy efficiency improvement. There will be energy saving programs in the society in order to save the electricity. So that all contributes to the decreasing of this total energy demand. Yes.
Thank you. I think let's open up to questions from the audience. And again, if you have any questions in the audience, please type in the Q&A box. So the first one is from Qu Songzhe. So as Pierre mentioned in the end of your presentation, China would need to keep the trend and even exceed the current developing speed in renewable generation to reach carbon neutral. As we can see that solar is taking a major part of the renewable generation, and various research shows it's more stable than wind. However, solar panels usually retire after 2 or 3 decades. While China is reaching carbon neutral, how should people deal with the retired solar panels? And if it is inevitable, what will be the solution or alternative way? Maybe wind with hydrogen together?
I'd be happy to start on that. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but after those solar panels retire, maybe in 2 or 3 decades, I think the first step is that new solar panels should be installed to replace the old ones. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. In fact, that's already happening. The first generation of solar panels that were installed in some solar farms 10, 15 years ago are actually, some of those are now being retired and replaced with newer models. So I think at one level, it's just a question of replacing capital stock with new capital stock, like happens in any industry. There have been questions about the disposal of solar panels from a waste management standpoint, and that's very important to do correctly. I don't think there's any big technical challenge in doing that. We can disassemble and dispose of them in ways in which any toxic substances are contained. I think it's very important that that happens, but it's not, there's no great challenge, I think, in doing that. So I hope that addresses the questioner's question.
Pierre, do you want to join any offer? Okay.
No, I think David answered clearly as far as I can tell.
Thank you. We have a question from Henry Chan. What is the role of hydrogen play in the energy policy in general?
I'd be happy to answer that as well. I'll have any of my other panelists jump in. And I'm going to start with the headline and then explain why I say it. I think the headline is that hydrogen can be a very important clean fuel, but hydrogen can also be a dirty fuel. It's important to do it correctly. And here's the background. Hydrogen is actually the most, the most common element in the universe, the most widespread element in the universe. But it doesn't exist naturally on its own. You can't drill into the earth and mine hydrogen. Hydrogen exists bound with molecules, with other types of molecules. So you find hydrogen in water, for example, bound to oxygen. Or you find hydrogen in coal or natural gas bound to carbon molecules and a number of other molecules. So in order to get hydrogen to use it as a fuel or to use it in industrial processes, you need to apply energy in order to get the pure hydrogen. And that's done commercially around the world today in a number of different ways. But here's the key. If you take hydrogen by, say, applying energy to coal or applying hydrogen or applying energy to natural gas, something which is called steam reformation of methane. If you do that, you produce carbon dioxide emissions. You don't, it's not a zero carbon process, far from it. And so there's a risk that as we transition to a hydrogen economy, that we actually make the global warming problem worse. And this is particularly a problem in China because there's so much coal in China that if the hydrogen in China is generated from coal, it's actually going to be going in the wrong direction on global warming. However, there are ways to make hydrogen that are zero carbon processes. And in particular, if you take renewable energy and use a process called electrolysis to separate the hydrogen molecules out of hydrogen from water molecules, that's zero carbon use of hydrogen. Then you can burn it and you can use industrial processes and it's zero carbon. And you can do the same thing with nuclear energy, by the way. So, that may be a little bit more technical detail than some of our audience wants. So I hope that's helpful to you. And I just want to go back to my headline, which is that hydrogen can play a really important role in the transition to a zero carbon economy, because hydrogen, burns at high temperatures, has a number of attributes that are really important for power generation, for heat, for industrial processes. But it can be done wrong. If it's done wrong, it makes the global warming problem worse. If it's done right, it seriously contributes to the solution to global warming.
And just to add a few words onto what David said, I've been looking a bit at the development of hydrogen in China. There are a lot of companies that have rushed into the space because it's a new area and because it has a lot of potential for playing a role in a lower carbon future. The largest hydrogen producer in China is one of the national oil companies, Sinopec. Most of the hydrogen, if not all of the hydrogen that company produces is gray, but I think it's worth watching what Sinopec does in the future because recently the company's chairman came out and announced that Sinopec was aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050, and the company expects hydrogen to play a big role in its efforts to meet its carbon neutrality target. And so, just to reiterate what David says, that how Sinopec does this will, we should be watching to see whether Sinopec does this sort of in the right way or in the wrong way. Sinopec has they are interested in moving into the green hydrogen space. And so for me, watching what Sinopec does, in the coming years and decades will be one indicator of the role hydrogen will play in China's economy going forward.
Thank you, Erica. So a question from Vicky Fei from Beijing Yunyu Law Firm. Could any speaker share the US experience of using green finance facilities to promote clean energy industry? I guess that's David.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that also. There's been, I think, really good history, and I'm hopeful that in the next few years, we're going to see even more of this. Dating back more than 10 years, the US federal government has had some programs to support the finance of clean energy technologies. One of the most successful is a program at the US Department of Energy, which provides loan guarantees for clean energy technologies. And those loan guarantees help to reduce financing costs, bring private capital into the sector. And one of the most important success stories, I think, out of that program was the development of the US utility scale solar and wind program. Back around 2010, 2011, private lenders were unwilling to provide capital for large utility scale solar and wind projects. The US Department of Energy's loan guarantee program provided loan guarantees to cover the risks that the lenders perceived associated with those programs for the first half a dozen or so such projects. Now, there are dozens, maybe hundreds of those projects, in the United States, and it was really U.S. green finance from the federal government that brought that type of project to the marketplace. Then, in addition, our state governments have had some really creative and innovative green banks. Connecticut, New York, California, some other governments have provided important financing tools, really with the same type of idea, to help bring clean energy projects to the marketplace with a variety of different financing tools, way of covering first loss risk and other types of losses from the private sector. Final comment, there's a number of very significant proposals in Washington, D.C. right now on this topic, something called the Clean Energy Accelerator, which is part of President Biden's plan, and some other ideas that I think could really put this whole area, on steroids and make it grow even more in the years ahead. So very hopeful about that.
Thank you, David. Just in the interest of time, we're moving on to more questions. A question from Wu Yuezi. Besides some direct cooperation between the US and China, would these two countries collaborate on the decarbonization in some regions such as Africa, the Pacific area, and Latin America, because climate change is a global issue?
Well, I can have a go at this, and unless, Changi, would you have something to contribute here? Perhaps, you've not answered questions directly so far, so please go ahead.
Yes. I worked in the Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization. We call it GETCO. And in our future vision, we need all the countries to work together to reduce the CO2 emissions, to cooperate together. And one important way is to develop their grid system, to interconnect that grid system, not only domestically, but also cross-country and even cross-continental. For example, in the United States, in the European Union, they can utilize the solar energy from the Africa continental, but you need to interconnect the power grid system between Africa and the Europe continental first. And this has already happened. It's for example, in the internal European Union, you can find that they have already been interconnected. In the Scandinavian countries with the UK and Germany, there are a lot of grid interconnections in order to promote the hydropower in the Scandinavian, and also the wind power overseas, and the PV in Germany, etc. So this is the same for other continental, like Africa, like Latin America, and South Asia continental. We can develop step by step. First, we can interconnect several countries in small region, like in the Southeast Asia or in the Northeast Asia, and between North Africa and the West Asia. So then after that, we can interconnect more countries into this kind of global energy interconnection system in order to better utilize over the world. So, and China has done a lot research and also pilot projects in different countries, like in Brazil, the state grid Corporation of China has invested in the first ultra-high voltage in Brazil in order to transmit the hydropower from Amazon area to its capital, and in the North Africa and Congo River, CGEP promote this kind of renewable development and grid interconnections. So help those countries to enhance their natural climate contributions in order to achieve the Paris Agreement temperature control together.
So we're moving on to the next question by Ma Yifei. I would like to ask you, how would you view the carbon neutral trajectory of specific industries, such as transportation and logistics?
I'm happy to say a word about transportation, which we haven't touched on yet. And you asked about earlier, Professor Wu. I think it's a very important area. It's globally, it's the second most important source of greenhouse gas emissions, and China is in many ways leading on decarbonization of this sector. Last year, more than half of the electric vehicles in the world sold globally were in China, and Chinese government, Chinese industry has really committed to being ahead of the curve and trying to develop electric vehicle technology, has installed a wide network of electric vehicle chargers around the country. There are a lot of developments in the United States on this as well, by the way. President Biden is committed to building 500,000 electric vehicle chargers around the United States, and a lot happening in Europe as well, so in Japan. And so it's a pretty big global movement in this direction. And it's going to be absolutely central to decarbonization of the economy. One very interesting area, tying back to our earlier discussion of hydrogen, is that heavy duty vehicles, such as long distance trucks and other types of equipment, are a really sensible place for hydrogen technology. And I think there's a move towards decarbonizing the fuels used for heavy duty trucks with hydrogen. It's a little bit behind, I think, the use of batteries in smaller vehicles, but I think it's something we're going to see coming in the years ahead that's going to be very important. And then if we produce the hydrogen in a clean way, like I was talking about earlier, it's really a way of decarbonizing heavy duty trucks.
And picking up on where I left off with Sinopec and hydrogen, they are building hydrogen refueling stations at their service stations. Sinopec has more than 30,000 stations around the country. And I think as the company looks towards the future and the energy transition, it doesn't just want to have diesel and gasoline at those stations. And so one of their things they've been rolling out is hydrogen refueling stations. Sinopec operated 27 of the 100 hydrogen refueling stations in China at the end of 2020. And they plan to build, I think, 1,000 by 2025. So very ambitious plan to roll out these stations and promote the use of hydrogen as a transportation fuel.
Great. So just quickly, I think when you look at different sectors, the message that you keep coming back to is that clean electricity, zero carbon electricity is a very, very important, actually a crucial enabler of decarbonization. So think about it like that. The economy will be divided into two parts, a big one and a small one. The big one is everything that will be decarbonized by consuming directly clean electricity, okay? And the smaller part is everything that you cannot electrify eventually will be decarbonized via a clean vector, which will be a byproduct of clean electricity. So David mentioned hydrogen, this is a typical example. So we can look sector by sector, and there are very important lessons to be learned, of course, and knowledge to be gained. But it's very important to keep an eye on the big picture. And the big picture is most of the success will be, or success or failure or relative success will be decided by our ability to build massive systems of zero carbon electricity generation, either because we want to consume it directly in everything from transport, home heating, home cooling, light industry, or because we want to turn it into something that can be burned into sectors that cannot be electrified, such as heavy industry via hydrogen, for example.
Thank you, Pierre. The next question is from Jim Robertson. The projections for China energy use and production are a hockey stick projection, same or increase for years, then a rapid decrease or change. Can you provide assurances on the long-range projections?
Sorry, what are we talking about exactly? Projections of what? I'm not sure I got it.
Well, that's what they wrote in the question mark. I don't know either. Energy use and production projections.
Well, Chang said something earlier about why energy demand should plateau in China after 2030, 40.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question. As you know, the models and the predictions has huge uncertainties, not only about the energy demand, but also for the future socio-economic development. How much, how many the population it will be, and how will the GDP growth it will be. There are huge uncertainties on this, and what's the future energy demand elasticities in order to predict the future energy demand is also uncertain. That's that's why the results vary very differently from different institutions because they have different assumptions. And what we can do is we can compare different the results from different institutions and the basic assumptions they use, and we can do more sensitivity analysis for those results. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chang. The next question from the Yifan. What role do electric transmission lines play in China's clean energy transition?
That's one for Chang again.
Well, the simple answer for the question is the power transmission lines is especially the ultra high voltage lines is will be very critical for China's future power system. As I explained in my slides, the renewables are located mainly in the west or north or south west of China. They are 2,000 or even 4,000 kilometers away to the load centers such as Shanghai and eastern load centers. So with the traditional transmission lines such as the 550 kilovoltage transmission line, it's mission impossible to transmit this electricity from 4,000 kilometers away. But nowadays, with this kind of ultra high voltage, it's feasible to do so, and is economic efficient to transmit the renewables even from the far west to the far.
So I just had a quick point to add on. I think looking at these power lines that can transmit electricity over long distances, I think they play sort of an important role in transitioning to a lower carbon future. If, as Chang said, they were going to be transmitting power generated by renewables. If it's power generated by fossil fuel, then it's a different story.
Thank you all. We still have a couple of questions, but we are running out of time. And so if any of the speakers would be so kind to perhaps even address the Q&As in the box, that will be great. Otherwise, I want to thank you again, all of the speakers, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. And we welcome you to join our next seminar in this series in May. Date, time, and guest speakers to be announced. And so for a full calendar of upcoming events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy and Columbia Global Centers in Beijing online. I'm hoping our hosts will be able to type in the links in the chat box to the audience. Again, I hope, again, this panel has provided many thoughts for us to digest and think further. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you soon.